Hello, welcome to our latest event, Brexit Threats and Opportunities, with our esteemed guests, Mrs. Bernardine Adkins, Mr. Gleason, and Professor Jonathan Portis. We will discuss the implications of Brexit, with special emphasis on the main threats and opportunities arising from the new connection between the UK and the EU. Ms. Atkins is a solicitor and Belgian advocate and head of EU trade and competition law at international law firm Gowling WLG. Mr. Gleason, partner at Clifford Chance, joined the firm's financial regulation group in 2007, where he specializes in financial markets law and regulation. Professor Portis is professor of economics and public policy at KCL and an expert in a wide range of economic policy issues and international economic and financial issues. Professor Portis, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Eleonora. Thanks for inviting me. It's now February the 6th. For those of us who have been, I think it's fair to say, both horrified and fascinated by the political and economic events of the last 5 years. In some ways, this last month has been a bit of an anticlimax. We've been waiting for Brexit to actually happen for a good 4 years. Well, it has happened. And what does it mean? And in some ways, of course, we don't really know. We know that there aren't that many queues at ports. That's partly because people aren't shipping stuff. It's partly, of course, because the impact of the pandemic on the economy has been so huge that it's actually very difficult to tell what the impacts of Brexit are. So at the same time, we can see headlines like that of today when Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Transport, blithely assures us that everything is moving precisely as normal, that there are no queues, that trade is flowing as normal. And at the same time, a rather scary splash headline in today's Observer, based on a survey by the Road Haulage Association, which tells us that our exports to the EU have fallen by more than 2/3, if it were true, and it probably isn't. One should take it with a pinch of salt, an absolutely horrifying figure. After all the politics, we are now confronting the realities of Brexit. What does it actually mean for the UK economy, for UK society? What are the implications of the new UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was signed on, I forgot whether it was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day itself, when they finally put the finishing touches to the spreadsheet showing which fish would be British and which would be European after Brexit. But we now have that document. We now have this new relationship. For better or worse, businesses, small and large, are going to have to make it work. So tonight we have two very distinguished experts in the field of, in the legal field, but covering rather different aspects of the law as it pertains to our trading relationship with the EU, both in the general commercial and trading sense and in particularly as respects the financial sector. And we're going to try and explore what does this new relationship mean? What will it mean for business? What will it mean for London as the financial sector? What will it mean for the regulatory requirements that businesses face, both here in the UK and should they wish to trade with the EU in the future? To what extent is what we've seen so far, are they teething and transitional problems, which will quickly resolve themselves and we can get back to business as normal? And to what extent are they more far-reaching structural changes in our trading relationship? That's probably enough from me. I'm doubtless will say more as we go on and give away some of my own views, but I really do want to hear from both Bernardine and Simon. So I'm going to start with a couple of fairly open questions. First, Bernardine, what do you think the really what are the really major changes that result from this, from the transition from where we were effectively up until December 31st, if not members of the EU, still continuing to act as if we were members of the EU. And now, what are the big headlines? What are the most important changes for businesses in particular to be aware of? You're still muted, I'm afraid, Bernardine.
Yeah, good.
So we always do that.
Yeah, in many ways, it wasn't a surprise in the sense of, by and large, we kept to what Theresa May told us was going to happen in 2017, the Lancaster House. We're out of the customs union. Therefore, yes, in principle, the UK can actually conclude free trade agreements with third countries. We're also out of the single market. So from a goods perspective, we now have borders as between the UK and the rest of the EU. And also, don't forget, we now have a border in the middle of the UK between Great Britain and Northern Ireland as well. So that's goods. We now have, and so we're now, people are grappling for the first time with rules of origin, because it looks great in principle, free trade, tariff free, but actually you only get free tariffs if you can prove that your goods are of UK origin. And there is a rub. So there's a huge amount of work around that. Then on services, services have largely been neglected. Really, we are flipping back onto the WTO rules around freedom of services. We've got really a baseline, which is free market access. We're not going to be discriminated against just because we're British, as opposed to Japanese or anything else. But there is so much to be built on vis-a-vis financial services, for example. So rather than the old mutual recognition, where we basically harmonise up to a certain standard around prudential supervision, public health, for example, and then we mutually recognise each other. We're flipping back onto this notion called equivalence, whereby the EU unilaterally will decide in these services areas, does the UK meet the EU standards, in which case, yes, we'll let you come into our market and play. So it is very much, the power there is with the EU. And so the big question, which I'm sure Sam will come on to, is the UK going to accept that, or just take its toys and say, sorry, we're going to play with our own regulatory systems and we're not going to wait around for equivalence. So there is a huge seismic change. But the one point I would make, and maybe it's a legal geeky point, but I think it is fundamentally important. What we have now is an international trade agreement between states. So as individuals, as businesses, we are, putting it crudely, insects. There's nothing we can do to force that enforcement. And when we've lost that character of European law, EU law, it was directly effective, whereby we could take it, enforce it in a national court. We have lost that connection to ensure and enforce rights as such. And I think that's absolutely a fundamental seismic change. I probably gone on for long enough now.
No, that's you've only just that's fascinating, and that really is something which we don't talk about very much. That loss of the principle of direct effect, and the right to, and hence the right to be able to appeal to the principles of EU law in our own national courts when it comes to regulatory or business issues. It will be very interesting to see, as that realization sinks in, how that actually affects us. But I'm not going to talk for too much. I'm going to hand straight over to Simon to give some views from his perspective, what he thinks the really big deal is.
Okay, absolutely. One of the curiosities about trade arrangements all over the world is that they tend to sort of work for goods and they tend to sort of not work for services. This is a general thing. I mean, the general agreement on tariffs and services is very much the runt of the WTO litter, whereas the GATT sort of works, the GATT certainly doesn't. Europe's attempts over the years to write a services directive have been disastrous. Governments get really worried about the provision of cross-border services into their territories because they feel they're potentially not protecting their local citizens. And the way that this has always worked is that it's really hard to do cross-border services, and it's particularly hard in financial services because the idea of your citizens, depositing their life savings with some foreign bank that collapses is just terrifying. So even in the GATS, even in the sort of global trade agreements, you have this thing called the prudential carve-out that says, oh, but we don't mean financial services. Financial services are different and special. And so when it comes to financial services, the really weird thing about the way the European Union was constructed was the fact that it did have a robust cross-border financial services passporting arrangement. That's almost unknown in the rest of the world. It was very strange. It was there because the UK wanted it to be there. Of course, once the UK steps out of that legislated passport, it's back into the ordinary world of cross-border service provision, which is not on your nelly, which is roughly where we are at the moment. So effectively, financial services provided from the UK has gone from the most permissive cross-border environment in the world to nothing, which is roughly where we are at the moment.
So as Bernardine says, though, we will, of course, be seeking some form of, we're seeking to rebuild some part of that relationship by seeking equivalence in some respects, at least, for trade in financial services exports to the EU. Is there any realistic prospect of that happening?
Absolutely none whatsoever. One of the baffling things about the coverage of a lot of Brexit has been the sort of cheerful assumption that, oh, well, there's the possibility of equivalence. Well, the key point here is this. I mean, UK regulation is pretty similar to US federal regulation. In fact, it's damn nearly identical. There is absolutely no cross-border passport between those two markets. The mere fact the rules are the same gets you absolutely nowhere in this regard. The point that our friends in Brussels have made absolutely clear is they are only going to grant equivalence when it is in Europe's interest to do so. Now, what's important about that is Europe has recently produced a communication that makes absolutely crystal clear where it thinks its priorities are. And it thinks its priorities are to develop an onshore financial market. Now, if that is your starting point, you absolutely do not grant cross-border rights to anyone. Because what you want, so what the European Union will do for the next 2 or 3 years is to try and close its borders as tightly as it can to cross-border financial service provision of any kind, to see whether it can create an onshore deep and liquid financial market of its own. And it's absolutely explicit in the policy communication. The reason for that is that they perceive that Europe loses its strategic autonomy if it's dependent on a financial services centre outside Europe. And if you or I were sitting in Brussels, that is exactly the conclusion that we would come to as well, because it's right. But if that is where Brussels is coming from, then you can deduce, I think, without too much difficulty, that there will be no equivalence, certainly for the next 2 or 3 years. Not in financial services, anyway. I mean, why would they?
Bernardine, I mean, what Simon said sort of reflects a lot of the commentary one gets here, which is that this is a deal which is, once you clear aside all the smoke and mirrors, is very much a deal that could have been designed, from a mercantilist perspective at least, could have been designed by the EU. That is to say, for exports of goods, it provides the EU with tariff-free access to our markets, and of course we have a huge trade deficit in goods. Whereas for services, it gives us little or nothing, and allows the EU to essentially exclude us from their markets. Is that your perspective too?
Yes, absolutely. And the only positive I can see is that we actually did stay in the Horizon programme, which is around collaboration around R&D. So that much is good. But it is really is slim pickings in terms of what we came away with, quite frankly.
I mean, I think one thing which in terms of how trade in goods is going to work. You mentioned rules of origin. My understanding is that that part of the agreement hasn't really begun to kick in yet, in the sense that there's been that, in particular for goods that are coming here from the EU, we're really not enforcing any rules at all at the moment, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
That's something, you know, that still to come, and business still has to grapple with, is what happens when the UK actually starts imposing the controls which are set out in the agreement.
Yeah, the real pain is really going to start to kick off in April, because at the moment the UK, you know, pre-Christmas issued this thing called the border operating model, explaining how it's going to work the border, and it's given a lot of easements because it knows people aren't ready. So April, it's going to start the phytosanitary checks, and this obviously is about food. And health around food. This is going to come as a massive shock to people because it is so detailed. Things like, you think, well, it's a frozen pizza. Where's the problem? It's like, no, it's got cheese on it, which is animal origin. So you need to find a vet to sign off on that to get that out and in. So those phytosanitary checks are going to start hitting in the UK in April. So that is when I think we're going to start to see shortages in the supermarkets. People may not have adjusted fast enough. And then at the moment, people can defer customers' payments until July. So again, there's going to be another, you know, pain that's going to happen in that period of time. So it's slowly going to come through over time. Plus, a lot of people stockpiled. So we've got a little window. This is actually a little honeymoon period, believe it or not, quite frankly. We've yet really to see the pain around rules of origin. And the other thing is, the UK has always been a very open market. So we take a lot of components in from all over the world, not just the EU. But in order to get preferential tariff treatment, you need to be of UK origin. So you have to establish that, and so you have to have all the documentation. You have to really know your own supply routes to be able to confidently say it on the invoice, this is of EU origin. And then you also have to ask, well, what's the product? What's the tariff, customs classification? What are the specific rules of origin on that particular product? Am I within that? And then you can have all the challenges coming through time. Did you apply the appropriate classification? Do you owe money? Do they owe you money, etc., etc.? So a world of pain is coming everybody's way in the interest of free trade.
And how do you think that, you know, because there are a number of different ways that businesses could respond to that. They could, one is simply that actually it's a lot more forms, but in the end we will learn how to cope with them. And to the extent there are extra costs, we will just increase our prices and pass it on to consumers. One is to actually say, this is just not worth the hassle. We're going to have to restructure our supply chains. And that could be in a number of ways. It could mean sourcing, for importers, taking goods from outside the EU or from inside the UK instead. It could mean the relocalization, I should say, of supply chains that have grown up across Europe. Do you have any sense of how that will apply? What businesses, how they're going to respond?
It's fascinating. There is one size does not fit all. Every company, every product line, every supply chain is really very specific. So it can vary from, we're not pulling out of the UK, but we had plans to expand. We're not doing any more. We're now going into Germany. Or people are just we're going to feel the pain. We've got enough flex within our profit margin to take on that extra burden, that extra cost. Or we're going to pass this cost down to the consumer. Or absolutely, we're going to get to grips with it. We're going to get the software in place, work out what are supply chains. Others are using it as an opportunity to work out their supply chain because they've grown up over 20, 30 years and no one's ever really blown the dust off it and said, actually, is this the most effective way of doing it? So some people are using it as an opportunity to revise their supply chains, modernize them and ask, are they getting the most, are they procuring in the most efficient way possible? So it really does vary according to the specifics of the company and also the regulatory system that they are operating under as well.
And Simon, the same set of questions applies, I think, in the financial services and associated services sphere. What will the response be from UK and European firms?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question because the problem, this is particularly clear in financial services, the regulators have this sort of paradigm of a person doing a thing in a place. The bloke picks the phone up to the client, says, do you want some securities? The client says yes, and that's a service provided in one place or the other. this business doesn't work like that and hasn't worked like that for many years. You know, the trouble with everything increasingly happening in cyberspace is that to the extent it can be said to physically happen anywhere, it probably happens on a server farm in Iceland. So the questions of exactly where is the thing you're trying to regulate done in the first place is much harder in the world of services than it is in the world of physical goods, because at least in physical goods you can point to the thing and say it's there. I don't know what you point to when you try and identify where a securities transaction is affected. And the other thing, there's been all sorts of chat about equity securities trading has moved from the UK to Europe. What has actually happened is a bunch of messages that used to pass over one server, which was ostensibly owned by a company in the UK, now passes over a different server, which is probably next door to it, which is ostensibly owned by a company in Belgium. If you think about stock exchanges as big things with people in top hats and pillars, that's a big change. If you think about a stock exchange as something that exists on a server farm somewhere, wherever, it's not. So, you know, to the extent that what you're seeing, what it looks like from my perspective anyway, is you've got a massive rebuilding of the booking model that sits behind the business. But in terms of the impact on what the actual people are doing, thus far, there's not much.
Yeah, so what happened? So that equity trading moves from London to, in legal terms, if not in any meaningful physical sense. What does that mean economically? What does it mean for jobs and tax revenues, or does it not mean anything at all?
The square root of nothing, really. I mean, as we all discovered at the early stages of this, the reality of the thing is that the contribution that the city makes to the UK is really very little to do with tax paid by banks. It's to do with tax paid by people who live and work here, and by the fact that because they live here, they spend their money here. That's where the economic benefit to the UK is. And as I say, as increasingly the location of the service gets divorced from the location of the people, then it becomes harder to predict. So at the moment, the answer to the question, what has the impact been in financial services, is not terribly much at all. Now, the one thing I can tell you, and I suspect everybody knows this, you know, having spent my entire life doing financial regulation, I know two things. One of them is the short-term impact of regulatory change is much less than you think it's going to be. The other is the long-term impact of regulatory change is generally a great deal larger than you think it's going to be. So the fact that nothing terribly much has changed thus far doesn't necessarily tell us anything interesting about what the world will look like in 5 or 10 years' time.
Well, indeed. And so before we move into on to sort of the next set of topics, that's a good cue for me to ask you both, you know, if you had to, if I forced you now to say, well, what does, in your areas of expertise more generally, what do you think will and won't have changed in 5 years' time in a, you know, that makes a difference to jobs, to incomes, to London, to the rest of the UK, indeed to the European Union? What do you think will have changed? What won't have changed? Bernardine, you're not on mute, so you can go first.
Yeah, it's funny because I think we're all looking about this notion that the UK is going to deregulate. I'm not seeing it. Because if you look at actually what the UK has done already, it's made things infinitely more complex and difficult. Two examples: sanctions. We've obviously, you know, we've always had our own sanctions regime, but it's by and large agreed with the EU. Whereas before it was 2 years in jail for serious breaches. It's now 10. And where was fairly simple prohibitions adopted into UK law, now it is drafted in such a complex fashion. Another example is the National Security and Investment Bill, which is about foreign direct investment and also direct investment, which is the government wishes to oversee that in certain sensitive areas, which in fact will include food at the extreme. That's a mandatory filing. The UK, we normally never have mandatory filing for mergers in the competition sector. So quite unheard of. So what I'm observing, things are actually getting more complex, more regulated, contrast to what the Brexit bounce is supposed to be. And the other thing that I'm seeing is that we may actually stay rather static. Query whether it's actually the EU that is going to evolve. Now that we are outside of the EU, we've obviously have lost that influence. And I can see that in competition law, for example. There is a big reassessment of competition law. What does it do for good in the capitalist game? So to date, it's always been Chicago's School of Economics, as they call it, the laissez-faire, free hand of the market. Everything is viewed through the consumer welfare paradigm. Whereas there's a thinking coming from the US, and people can be rude about it and call it hipster economics, Brandeis thinking, which is basically competition law should be actually trying to facilitate fairness, equality of payment, environmental controls, etc., etc. There seems to be more appetite for that accommodation of competition policy in the EU than the UK. The UK is very much, no, we're going to stick to our traditional econometrics tests. Consumer welfare is king. We're not going to go down that hipster route. So I wouldn't be surprised if actually, ironically, in many respects, we stay static and it's the rest of the world that moves away. That's just what I'm seeing at the moment.
I'm always fascinated. I want to know who it is who thinks that Singapore is this lightly governed deregulatory heaven. I mean, I can assure you, having done some financial regulatory work in Singapore, quite a bit of it over the years, I can tell you that the idea that Singapore is a deregulated paradise is a very long way away from the truth. I mean, the curiosity about this is that the UK has written Europe's financial regulations for the last 30 years. So it is not at all surprising that there's absolutely no particular desire either in the UK industry or in the UK government to move away. There are some interesting questions about where Europe goes, but there's a bigger issue here, and I must confess, I don't know whether this is cheating, but I would love to put a question to you, Jonathan, on this point. And to what extent can these sorts of regulatory changes actually reverse an existing economic trend? Because the trend in financial services has been unmistakable for the last 100 years. It has been to move to a smaller number of more concentrated services. I mean, it's no different from a number of other industries in that regard. So the question that you're looking at in financial services is, do you think the effect of regulatory change is potentially so great that it can put an industry-wide trend into reverse? Now, I must confess, my instinct is it probably can't. And the reason for that is that the building blocks of financial services are human beings. And the simple economics of being a banker are you want to be in the place where there are the largest possible number of alternative employers. This explains in a nutshell why financial services concentrates in a smaller and smaller number of places, because it increases the bargaining leverage and bargaining power of the individuals who are the basic building blocks of the business. So my forecast is that Europe will not succeed in building its own financial centre because it will simply be unable to persuade enough high-quality people away from their optimal source of revenue. But it just takes us back to the question of assume a thoughtful and intelligent government using every lever it can to try and force an industry to change tack. How successful are those levers capable of being when facing a broad trend? I don't know.
I think that's a fascinating question, and it does indeed go much wider than Brexit, and raises, so when I and I don't know, I'm guessing roughly, Simon, that you might be about my age, but when I was growing up in London, So my parents moved to London in the early 1970s. I was 6 or so at the time, and during the 1970s, inner London saw its population fall by about 20%, because there was still, the light manufacturing, which had been one of the things London did, was essentially was completely destroyed, or it was no longer economic to do that in London. And I remember a mentor of mine then, who was at that time a BBC engineer, telling me, about fiber optic cable and how it would destroy cities, because once you had fiber optic cable, and the communication technologies that would facilitate, why would anyone want to live in an expensive, crowded city when you could work from home from Devon or Scotland or whatever? Now, of course, he was completely and utterly wrong for the very reasons that you have just set out, which is that people like people and want to be close to people. Or at least he was wrong for the next 30 years. So the interaction of Brexit with COVID, the impact of COVID, whether COVID is in fact the shock which tells us that actually working from home is feasible, when working remotely is feasible at scale in a way which it hadn't been before. And what that implies for the economics of London, I think, is a fascinating question, and really a very, very important one, and one which I genuinely don't know the answer to, and whether there is, in some sense, whether this will indeed prove to be a turning point for cities in general, and for the sort of agglomeration economics and the economics of being near to other people, which have been so important. I sincerely hope it isn't, in that, because I suspect, again, probably like the two of you, and probably like most people watching this, I value the things that come with being in a city like London, not just the economics. But it's very hard indeed to say.
Absolutely.
Let's so we've covered London. Let's perhaps pass on now to two people, and what the implications are of the ending of free movement, and the very, very limited indeed provisions on mobility for work or business purposes that are contained in the TCA. What impact is that likely to have? I don't know which of you wants to go first on that one.
I'm happy to have a go.
Go ahead.
So from an EU perspective, what we enjoyed is, the four freedoms: freedom of movement, people, capital, and services. So we've lost the free movement of workers, of people, which means that it's actually, instead of the EU deciding whether we as third country nationals can gain access to the EU, this is a question that's still for the competence of individual member states. So to the extent to which you can gain access to employment in a third country, in a EU country, say France, for example, it is very much a question of actually looking at the specific rules of France. And so, throughout the document in the TCA, in certain areas, for example, the provision of legal services, being the one I'm most aware of. Yes, you've got the principles of, market access to provide English legal services, as long as you don't do EU services, and non-discrimination. And then there's a ton of exclusions. So individual member states have got their own exclusions. And so we're going to be seeing that replicated time and time again across all the professions. So it's going to be a very hard yard. I think that's really, from individual perspective, where we're going to feel the pain, in that people have lost something. It's like so much of the underwiring of our economy and how we lived our lives, that aspect has gone. Unless, of course, I think you can find an Irish grandmother in which you've got an Irish passport and you're golden. So that I think is going to be very problematic. And so also access to professions. You've got provisions on mutual recognition of professions. But you've got very similar, provisions like that under the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and they've never used them. So, as someone was saying earlier, if the goodwill and the trust isn't there, it might not be possible to achieve that. And again, some member states insist, for example, Belgium insists if you wish to be a Belgian lawyer, for example, you have to be an EU national. And that we will see all over, you've seen the Daily Mail talking about, how it's disgraceful that the French insist on you being a French national if you wish to provide, or an EU national ski instruction. And we're going to be seeing that replicated as the pigeons come home to roost, putting it crudely. Simon, I don't know what views you have on that.
No, it's interesting. I mean, from a finance perspective, the area where this becomes most painful is international travel. Now, for the benefit of some of the younger listeners, they used to be possible to go to Europe on a regular basis. Many people did. Consequently, when folk were designing their sort of Brexit strategies and their post-Brexit strategies, these tended to be premised on the idea that the bank or the firm or whatever would have a European subsidiary, and somebody from the UK would flip over there fairly regularly just to keep an eye on what was going on and make sure it was all under control. Do that for more than about 60 days nowadays, and you will find yourself in prison for working without the appropriate visa. One of the big difficulties here is that once the UK rejected a deal on this subject with the EU, we are back into the world of national legislation. So if I'm a London-based banker and I need to go to Paris regularly, and I need to go to Frankfurt regularly, and I need to go to Madrid regularly, I need another couple of lawyers to work on my visa applications, or to work out when I need a work permit, what sort of work permit I need, whether I can go from France to Spain, or whether I have to go through Germany. The complexities of this issue are enormous. And again, as Bernardine was saying earlier, we've gone from a world where these things were completely invisible to a world where if you're a sort of highly mobile senior executive, you're not going to be able to do anything without checking with the legal department first, which is going to make life slightly more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And that analysis is going to be quite difficult. First of all, you have to work out under GATS what mode of service provision you're doing. Is it 1 to 4? And then you have to ask yourself, what's the service? One of the 59 possible services. Then you have to say, okay, what state are you going to again? Okay, what have they deposed before GATS in terms of what provisions what facilitations do they allow? It's an absolute minefield.
Yeah. Do you think this is an area where where both sides might decide it's in their interest to try and improve the DCA a bit over time? Since there's less of a sort of obvious protectionist justification on either side, really, for very restrictive rules and regulations on business visits, for example. At least in the UK side, you do see people, as for example, in the discussion of touring musicians saying, this is just crazy, why can't we work it out?
Mm. But don't forget, this UK government was elected on a platform of taking back control, which was more or less universally interpreted as meaning taking back control of immigration. If I were a UK politician, I would take the view that making any concession at all to Europe as regards allowing Europeans to come to the UK would be politically very dangerous. And if that is the case, then I can't imagine Europe saying anything other than, terribly sorry, you are the loser here.
That's right. Yeah.
And what about for people coming the other way, for people coming here? Obviously, the same rules apply, but how do you think this will affect? I mean, in particular, firms in London which do employ huge numbers of Europeans and which have benefited from the ability to do this without worrying about rules, regulations, or red tape.
It's quite interesting. I mean, the UK's rules on business travel to the UK are actually miles more liberal than almost any other European country going the other way. Now, that is all part, it's not so much that the UK thinks that's the right thing to do. It's more that's where it's been forced to go. Because if you're trying to be an international commercial centre, you cannot have barriers to entry. So I think for as long as the UK wants to be a financial services centre, it is going to be forced to allow much more generous access to Europeans. And of course, in the context of the conversation we just had, that then becomes a problem. Because if you've got more generous rules, you've got nothing to trade off. So, you can see this across financial services generally. The reason that Europe puts up barriers to UK banks doing business in Europe, whereas the UK does not put up barriers going the other way, is precisely because the UK actually wants to be a financial centre and is therefore forced to liberalise its access rules, whether it likes it or not, which takes it out of the poker game as far as the tit-for-tat piece is concerned.
What I think is also going to be interesting to watch is the countries with which we aspire to have free trade agreements, India being an obvious example. First thing India has asked for already when May went over to India was Modi said, can we have some visas, please?
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Having said, I'm sceptical that we will get a free trade agreement with India because India's never done a large free trade agreement. It's against Indian instincts, I think. But yeah, that's going to be something that people are going to ask to have put on the table for other free trade agreements with other third countries.
Well, that's a good segue into precisely that topic. I'm inclined to, interestingly, of course, that has been one thing where the Johnson government has moved quite a long way from the Theresa May government. We have actually in the new immigration system, which will apply both to Europeans and non-Europeans. This is my particular topic, of course, immigration. We've actually given the Indians a lot of what they would have wanted, and which Theresa May, who really didn't like immigration or at all, was unwilling to go. But in terms of liberalising the rules for people coming from India, in particular, students and skilled workers, we've gone some way. I think, as you say, Bernardine, for other reasons, the prospects of a free trade agreement with India are at best many, many years off on the most optimistic reading. But what do you think, and Simon, you mentioned this as well before, in a rather pessimistic aside about the prospect of getting anywhere on financial services with the US, what are the realistic prospects of a trade deals in particular with the US, but also other countries? And, and going beyond the headlines of would there be a deal, what realistically might the UK be able to get out of such deals?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think there's the slightest prospect of a broad spectrum trade deal with the United States, because I think agriculture will kill it. So I think what deals there are probably going to be sector by sector. Now, the interesting thing about financial services in this regard is that one or two folk on both sides of the Atlantic have worked out that if you had a sort of broad and deep alliance between the UK financial regulator and the US financial regulator, that duopoly would basically control global financial services. And that is quite an appealing prospect on both sides of the pond. And it's actually particularly quite an appealing prospect in DC. One of the points about the US's position was always that it was only too happy to agree broad regulatory cooperation and access with those countries which it regarded as being properly regulated. And that created an unbreakable block in US discussions with Brussels over financial services, because the Brussels position was always, because it had to be, you can't just grant equivalents to the UK, France, and Germany. If you're dealing with Europe, you have to grant equivalents to everybody, including Hungary, Bulgaria, and whatever. And that was the point at which the US said, sorry, no. Now, that problem has now gone. And I think, US policy is like Brussels policy, is like everybody else's policy. It is exclusively self-interested. But the US, the question for the United States, what's in it for us, of a bilateral deal with the UK, now has a very different set of dynamics to it, to the question of how might a deal with the European Union work. And interestingly, if you got that duopoly starting to establish itself, there are quite a number of other jurisdictions, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, others, who would be very happy to jump into that particular boat. So yeah, you can see something like that happening. But as I say, I do think it's probably sector specific and probably regional. I mean, I don't know, I mean, Bernardine may be more optimistic than I am, but I can't help feeling the days of the broad scope trade agreement between major nations probably aren't coming back for a bit.
No, I think that's probably right. I think two comments there. One on the general question of these, free trade agreements with third countries. One, for me, one of the big disappointments of the TCA, it didn't have this thing called triangulation of accumulation. It's a bit of a geeky phrase. It basically means, so at the moment you have, preferential tariff treatment if something is exclusively either EU, UK origin. But what the UK wanted was to say, look, we've got a free trade agreement with Japan. You've got one. Please, can we treat something also of Japanese origin? Can you deem that to be also of UK origin? And the EU said no. So from a goods perspective, in terms of having very, very complex supply chains, that was, I think, was a real disappointment. And it would be good if over time, if we can build relationships where we could get that triangulation accumulation. But on the US trade agreement, if one is to speak to the UK government, they say negotiations are very, very advanced. They're working on very advanced text, which surprises me, because, I mean, certainly with the EU, from what I take, my perspective is very much, if you're not putting agriculture on the table, we're not getting out of bed. We're not talking to you until agriculture's on the table, which is why I'm surprised to hear that these texts are so evolved. That said, as you said, it's now America first. Joe Biden is very much jobs first, American jobs first. So I don't know what we are going to throw under the bus, so to speak, in order to achieve that free trade agreements. As you know, there are winners and losers. Is it going to be politically acceptable in the UK? And then also you've got issues with Congress, because essentially, as I understand, they've got to get, if we want to get this deal through, we effectively need to do it by July in terms of the Congress mandate to oversee FTAs. So there are, I mean, huge amounts of optimism coming from the UK government. But if you speak to other people, deep, deep skepticism that is possible for a US deal.
But, yeah, just one point about that. I mean, I think the thing that people tend to forget, look at any piece of coverage in a broad distribution newspaper in this country about a potential trade deal, and this is as true of The Guardian as it is of the Daily Telegraph. What you will see is a 10-column inch article. The first column inch will say, "Ooh, trade agreement, that sounds like a good thing." And the whole of the remainder of the article will be talking about the threats to particular industries within this country that deal would pose. Contrary to popular perception, trade deals are staggeringly politically unpopular because the beneficiaries shut up and those who are going to get hurt complain like mad.
Also, I think there's things evolve. A lesson I think the UK has to learn, it needs to be transparent when it is doing these free trade agreements. That was a massive lesson that the EU learned when they were negotiating with the US in TTIP. They thought they more or less had a deal and forgot to ask everybody else about it. They learned the lesson. They must start circulating draft mandates. They must have open conversations, allow the European Parliament select committees. Here, I'm afraid we have yet to learn that lesson, and I'm hoping over time, as things evolve, the government will learn you need to be open, transparent, evolve everybody. If need be, have industry in the next door to the negotiations meeting saying this is what happens to industry if you do this. Because we're seeing now, as things unfold, the fiasco with shellfish, for example, not, the UK not understanding the legal position on that. So maybe we've got some hard lessons to learn, but one lesson we absolutely have to learn is about transparency and adequate consultation in good time.
Yes, well, precious little sign of that from this government at the moment, I'm afraid. But let's try and be optimistic, or at least forward-looking. What about all the new freedoms that we now have outside the dead hand of EU rules on things like state aid and competition policy? Both, what do you think the government will actually do substantively with its new powers, with a different state aid regime? We know that on March 6th in Rishi Sunak's budget, he's going to try and distract us from some of the less positive economic news, which, to be fair, is not entirely his fault, but by talking about, there will no doubt be a lot of announcements about free ports, about other things which we are now able to do because of Brexit. Both, what do you think the government will do in this area, and what difference will it make?
I could go first. I think observers of this need to, when everyone's watching this, you need to distinguish between what the government is saying in a press release and the reality. The two things don't match. And a great example of this is in state aid. You had a press release saying, Yahoo, it was a dreadful system. We've got a fabulous system now. Attached to that was a document, a consultation document, 40 basic questions. Is what sort of regime are we going to have? We don't know. I know we've got the TCA, we've committed to an independent authority. And what I find interesting, it is very much, I would say, encouraging litigation, third-party challenge of the grant of state aid. So I see it's an area that is going to be increasingly fraught, increasingly litigious. So if the UK does go down its, much more fluid, open, deregulated system, cooked into what it must do is litigation. So if I was, a recipient of state aid, and some of it nowadays, especially in the area, for example, of energy, are huge amounts of money to get the clean energy going, I want certainty. So actually, business is going to be crying out for a good, robust system and not a free-for-all, freewheeling, let's just wait until somebody takes a pot shot at the WTO, which seems to be the noise we're currently getting. So again, I just think the devil is going to be in the detail of this, and where we think we're going to end up is, I would think, probably somewhere very different. And what I find slightly amusing is the language they're using, the terminology. It's not state aid anymore, it's now subsidy control. We don't talk about undertakings anymore, they're economic actors. And what is this? Are we scared somehow we will be tainted, corrupted by EU law creeping across? Is this to stop, the ERG from word searching state aid when they look at the document? I mean, it's extraordinary the way we've departed from the tried and tested terminology that we all understand into something else. I don't understand what we're trying to achieve there, other than arguably open up far more law cases and more uncertainty moving forward. But we are at the moment very much in limbo as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly right. And you've got good careers advice to young lawyers wondering what to get into. Trade law, competition law. Oh my goodness, there are opportunities there. And if you know a little bit of economics, that'll help too. The curiosity about a lot of this, I mean, it's perfectly correct that the EU competition and law framework, and in particular the state aid piece, was an absolute disaster. 5-year-old in a kindergarten could have done a better job of tidying it up. So it's not that it's a brilliant system we're stepping out of, but you did get the impression that those in charge of stepping out of it only discovered at a very late stage that they were going to have something else to put in its place, which explains this extraordinary consultation document, which gives the impression that somebody who thought of the point on Monday had been told to produce a document by Wednesday. So I don't know where we go on this. We are going to have a system. We're going to need a system. You know what? It's going to look very similar in very broad outline to the one we've just stepped out of. And, in a different world, the same is true of financial services. We're going to have all sorts of ability to write new rules, but we wrote the rules that we're stepping out of, so we can't see any particular desire to write them. And even if you look at the political drivers, I mean, the classical example, those some of those who financed the Brexit campaign were very heavily motivated by a piece of European law called the AIFMD, the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive, which was basically the imposition of a slightly clunky regulatory regime on hedge funds. Now, everybody hated that for a whole bunch of reasons. It wasn't just the hedge funds who hated it, everybody hated it. But you know what, it's that. Now, technically, the government could say, you know what, we've decided we're going to deregulate hedge funds. I can assure you they're not going to say that. Even the Daily Telegraph would struggle to support that one. So by the time you finish looking at your new freedoms and saying, what is it we actually want to change, what they're actually going to change is probably pretty minor relative to what's there what's there already. So, I mean, certainly this is true not only in financial services, but every other area that I've looked at. There may well be freedoms, but there doesn't seem to be any particular plan for using those freedoms in any particular way.
Yeah. And another point I would say also that is going to possibly stymie what the UK government may put in place. Something that came out this summer is a white paper from the European Commission, basically saying we are going to have a state aid regime vis-a-vis third country companies operating in the EU who've been recipients of subsidies in their member states.
Yeah.
So damned if you do, damned if you don't. So there's a regime being put in place in the EU at the moment, and there's a real appetite for it to come into place. So that needs to be taken into account as well.
Well, I think that illustrates the extent to which the EU. Although we may have left the EU, that doesn't mean we've left a world where we're now in a world where we can simply ignore what happens in the EU. I think we're basically at the end of our time here. So if both of you want to have 30 seconds to sum up or to add anything that you feel I've missed, please do before I hand it back to our hosts.
No, I think Brexiternity is probably the right word rather than Brexit. This is ongoing. We've only just started the journey.
That's absolutely right. We are all going to be studying European law for decades to come.
Well, on that at least is an optimistic note. European law, trade, international economics are all subjects which are very much not going away. So thank you both, Bernardine and Simon, very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. I learned something. I'm sure everyone else did. And I will now hand back to Shavika and Eleonora to close the event.
Thank you, Professor. That's the end of our webinar. A massive thank you to our guests for taking the time to be here today and for your informative and thought-provoking discussion. Finally, thank you to all those who joined. We hope you liked the event as much as we did. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us for more events and updates. Bye.